Welcome to the first edition of Culturally Appropriate for the year. I hope last week you enjoyed our in-depth interview with Raw Egg Nationalist that we pre-recorded, but I'm excited to be back for our first live show. We have a very stacked show today. First, we're going to talk about Bret Easton Ellis and his recent book, The Shards, with English professor and scholar Dr. Lanta Davis. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the new Alexander Payne movie, The Holdovers, which cleaned up at the Golden Globes this week. And as always, I'm going to provide our weekly film rundown this week. This was Martin Luther King Jr. Day when there's an abundance of releases. So let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce scholar Dr. Lanta Davis, who wrote a really amazing academic article on the work of Bret Easton Ellis and some of the confessional Christian undertones of his work, which might seem like an unlikely pairing for those of you who have read Bret Easton Ellis, American Psycho, The Rules of Attraction, Less Than Zero, some of his more famous books. So Dr. Davis, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
So as I was looking through your other work outside of your article, which really caught my eye as I was prepping for this piece I was writing on the Shards that came out on Wednesday, I noticed you have a very wide swath of research interests. So I was wondering, before we get started, if you could tell us a little bit about your research interests and what you do at your university.
Yeah, I'm the kind of scholar you can really only find at a smaller university, and that I started out in 20th century American fiction. But then my first job out of grad school was at a very tiny university where I was the only person in the English department. So I had to become a generalist really fast and just kind of teach a wide variety of courses needed. And honestly, it just suited me really well. I love to follow my passions to different subjects. And so in the meantime, I've kind of researched everything from American Psycho to Dante, Renaissance art of the virtues and vices. I've researched Irish novels about the Troubles. And I mean, in part, I just like to wander. But if I had to kind of think of a link between everything, I just really enjoy art that feels a little disorienting, a little weird, and that maybe unsettles us a little and kind of pierces through us so that our eyes wake up, see a little differently. And within that, I think, is also my love for symbols, sacraments, which I think train us to see beyond the surface to a deeper, kind of more complex meaning. And it's really helpful in general, I think, especially in our age of tunnel vision with echo chambers and all that crazy stuff, that these kinds of things really make us sit and just learn to look more closely. So again, I know that I'm kind of all over the place, but I really do like those things that make us be a little bit patient with it, and that make us kind of see beyond it. And so that's why I think I've been all over the place from medieval times to 20th century to I've written a little bit on films, like all over the place. I really like that crazy mix.
So what was it about Bret Easton Ellis in particular that drew you to really discuss his work on this level?
Yeah. I mean, I was a 20-something girl, like fresh off the farm in South Dakota and a recent seminary graduate. So probably not the most likely audience for American Psycho, but I just fell in love with it in grad school. I thought it was just so fresh and funny and just had such a brilliant cultural critique. So I don't know. I think that book just got me. And I never seen anything like it and never really have seen anything quite like it since. So I like his other work as well, but I really do think American Psycho is a pretty great masterpiece in terms of just capturing a particular moment and really showing us the ugly that's behind the things that seem most beautiful.
Yeah, and something I talk about in my review of The Shards, which is Bret Easton Ellis's book that was published about a year ago, is sort of this idea of American Psycho being taboo or being contraband. I grew up in a part of Tennessee that was very influenced by large Baptist megachurches, and I saw the movie. I kind of like snuck into it with friends, like mom and dad didn't really know the whole gist of what the movie was going to be. And I bought the book because when you buy a book as a kid, your parents are just happy you're reading. And I was just kind of like horrified as I was reading it. I remember like that somebody was going to pick it up, and that actually happened. Like an aunt picked it up and was like, "What are you reading?" And I was like, "Please just let me find the page that is not going to be a problem for me." But that was a book that I feel like just reading it was wrong. And I felt conditioned that reading it was wrong. And I know that, you teach at a Christian university and a lot of your work focuses on faith. So, can you talk a little bit before we get into your article just about, how American Psycho might fit into a Christian worldview?
Yeah, it's a really funny thing to say that this story about a man who cooks women's heads and like pops out homeless man's eyeballs on the way home from dinner, I actually find deeply moral. Um, and as I say in the article, certainly Christian in certain respects. And I think the key to that for me was actually the prescript, which quotes both Dante and Dostoevsky. And that really cues you in that there's something more going on than just the violence that you read on the surface. And so, just even the position there of it being a cultural critique, and how many of his characters, both in American Psycho and Less Than Zero, Glamorama, they describe themselves in a way that just shows their existential crisis, that they seem to be on almost a kind of pilgrimage, searching for meaning, searching for morality, searching, I think, for a sense of transcendence, because they're not finding these things that are supposed to give their lives meaningful through their people that they're associated with, their jobs. All of these things seem to be very shallow. And so I think it's actually a deeply religious search that they're on. And so with Patrick's kind of monologue too, where he declares justice being dead, that no one is really feeling emotions, failure, grief. The world is senseless. He declares at one point in time, God is not alive. It just really gives you a sense that he wants to find God. He wants to find something more than what he's seen. And I think that that's a really deeply religious move, and something that kind of surprises me that other people don't see as much in his works. I was naive in saying this or thinking this when I first read American Psycho, but I remember going to class when we discussed it, and one of the girls was so frustrated with it she actually like threw the book across the table. um, but it just seems so profoundly moral to me, and that he was clearly looking for redemption, looking for truth, and just couldn't find it. And so my article is essentially saying that he wants to confess his misdeeds, he wants to be held accountable, and he wants to find something beyond what he is seeing in his world. And I think that's a very religious journey. And a surprising one, again, from a serial killer type novel.
Yeah, and something that I really appreciated about your article is you really go into detail about the structure of the book, in which we have these scenes of violence that are recounted. That as you admit, I know a lot of scholars have debated whether this actually occurred, and your thought is like it doesn't really matter, like whether he's this mentally sick and it's all a projection or whether it actually happened is not as important as the confessional element. But you really do go into detail about the level of consumerism that Ellis is talking about. I mean, one of my favorite quotes from it is when you discuss how Patrick Bateman makes sure to name what brand of toothpaste that he uses every morning. So, how do you think consumerism really interacts with the moral spine of the novel?
Yeah, I really think that American Psycho carries consumerism out to its logical conclusion, which is that if we start to see all of life as what can be bought and sold and thrown away, we start to see people the same way, that we are something that can just consume and use and enjoy and take delight in, but then also forget and toss aside. And so there's all sorts of ways that Patrick describes his killings in a way that's actually very similar to how he talks about the products that he's using, the music that he loves, the clothes that he wears. And it's based off of, in part, how the news trains us to see all of these events in a very similar way, that we have gossip about the Kardashians paired to this huge trauma that's happened in the world, or disaster. Like, we're reading about the wars and seeing how many people were killed. And right after that, reading about something utterly arbitrary. And it's written in the same tone, given very similar value in our time and space. And so I think by calling attention to the fact that we're just equating and equalizing these things, what that does to us and how that makes us change how we see one another. And so, yeah, so many things I think have just become sort of pushed into the same framework that consumerism creates for us. And both American Psycho and I think Fight Club, actually, as a film, does this really well too. and just in terms of highlighting what that's doing to our psyche, and how that's changing how we actually see and treat people.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too that like both of these cult books were made into film adaptations probably within 6 months of each. I think Fight Club came out in like October of '99 and American Psycho in April of 2000, and neither of the films really did well whenever they came out, but then since then have, they both gotten the Funko Pop treatment, which is kind of ironic. And they really have become some of the best films of that particular era. And both of them were written very early on. Both of them were written about 10 years before these adaptations came out. So what do you think it was about that kind of Y2K period that really made these films connect? And why do you think initially sort of the rediscovery of Chuck Palahniuk and Bret Easton Ellis didn't take off immediately, but then within 5 years, these movies became kind of hallmarks of cinema, and also the books themselves had kind of a resurgence?
Man, that's a good question about the cultural time and moment. I in part just think there were better films in the 90s, and like they were doing really interesting things. Then I feel like we went really generic and fairly sentimental in some ways, and kind of lost the challenge that some of those films do. Because I think like Tarantino also, when he's at his best, is doing some similar things in terms of shock value, but a kind of hidden morality. It seems as if it's really critiquing, I think, the height of consumerism, which we start to critique then probably later. And we've now turned morality, I suppose, into its own kind of form of consumerism. And so I think that's part of why maybe Bret Easton Ellis is making a bit of a comeback. But I don't know. It just seems as if, especially Hollywood being at its height and all of this kind of falseness before opening the doors that social media maybe gave us into the real like things and thoughts and ideas of what the celebrities were doing, all of a sudden it couldn't be hidden anymore. And so the films instead were kind of showing us what was underneath the surface. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that? You probably have more profound ideas of what's actually going on culturally during this moment.
There's that line in Glamorama whenever he keeps repeating, like, we slip down into the surface of things. Like, it's probably in the book 100 times. So, I mean, it is a very interesting period. And something that Ellis has written a lot about probably 10 years ago is that idea of the empire. And his new book, The Shards, really does kind of go into that as well, that there was this period when everything was gloss, everything was hidden. And we're not there anymore, whether that is 9/11 or whether that is social media, as you say. But, that idea that this violence might have been so taboo and this consumerism was something that we could really hide behind up until 9/11. And, we have that moment where George Bush tells everybody to go shopping and suddenly there's this very false very false conflation of consumerism and patriotism that happens, which, Ellis really didn't address because he wasn't, I guess, writing. He didn't really write a 9/11 book like a lot of authors did. I'm thinking about Jay McInerney, his contemporary and one of his best friends, who's got a Nashville connection for our viewers. He lived here and was married to a jewelry designer for a while. But he wrote the 9/11 book, The Good Life, in 2006, I think. And that was a book that dealt directly with being in New York City in 9/11. And Ellis just kind of didn't do that. Like, that was not something that was part of his oeuvre. I don't really know, but it is kind of strange that, like, these movies being released about a year, 2 years before 9/11, suddenly gaining that popularity afterward. And the books themselves also having that resurgence. We've talked a lot about American Psycho. And one of the things that I really did like about your article is that, one of the many things I should say that I liked about your article is that you focus a lot of attention on American Psycho, but you really do position it in terms of all of the work up to the time that it was published, which begins with Ellis's first book, Less Than Zero, which he wrote while he was in college, and then ends with Lunar Park, which is kind of this autofictive where he's a main character in it, but he's married. And that is something that you really do focus on in the article. So how do you think Ellis's trajectory through this, half dozen novels that were released between the mid 80s and 2005, how does he relate to other writers of that time period?
I I've read a little bit of Donna Tartt, his classmate at Bennington, I think it was. And it's interesting that I've read The Goldfinch, which I like some of and didn't love others. But I think there are several writers sort of looking at this time in terms of how we're just maybe anesthetizing ourselves from experiencing some of the deep pain and hurts of life. And so with Ellis, there's all sorts of ways in which you see that in the college experience, and then it develops further into Lunar Park, where he's kind of living in the suburbs, but there's still kind of an over medication, a kind of deadening to life. And so it fits in very different ways the trajectory of consumerism too, in terms of just promising us this happy life. And when we still seem to feel empty, when it doesn't seem to happen, then we might try these other options, these other alternatives, these ways of kind of pursuing different goods, different people to satisfy us, and then still again feeling confused when it's empty. And so I haven't read a ton of McInerney, weirdly enough. I know I should have, since he is so associated with Ellis. But I think there's ways, like I said, that I really see it in the films of the time. And I actually think in some ways Ellis's work bears a lot of resemblance to like Lolita as well, which I find to be a deeply moral book in secret. And I think there's just a really great way to just show us ourselves, that we seem to think we have it all together. Things seem to be very, very much going our way, have this high polish. But again, there's just this sense where we're not maybe facing some of these big questions, and instead just really enjoying what seems to be going well until all of a sudden it's shattered, as you mentioned, with things like 9/11. And now we've had COVID and all sorts of other things to shatter other kind of false cocoons that we've maybe put ourselves in.
Yeah, I'm just out of curiosity. You mentioned Lolita. Last week, one of the articles that I published was a review of Claire Dederer's Monsters, which is sort of
Oh.
based on her Paris review. And she has this amazing chapter on Lolita as a moral book. That, you know, people trying to cancel Vladimir Nabokov because of Lolita is a very misguided opportunity. And I just brought up that connection because it was such a fascinating, it was one of those pieces of like literary criticism. I was just like, yes, just ate it up. So that's like, it's a fantastic book that's sort of, I guess, from the opposite end of this cultural milieu, because she's writing from this feminist perspective, this author that writes for the New York Times, and the essay originally appeared in the Paris Review, but she has a very similar stance to you on Lolita, which is interesting. Something else that I wanted to talk about in terms of Ellis is that so much of his work has been about posturing. And I talk about this a little bit in the review of The Shards, that, as you said, people were throwing American Psycho against the wall. They were angry about it. He was accused of being this like toxic masculine misogynist, even as recently as Lunar Park in 2005. You know, he was still passing as this sort of like alpha male heterosexual. And then come to find out in the early 2000s, he kind of quietly comes out as gay. And a lot of The Shards is really about that. A lot of The Shards is about how he was actually closeted in his perspective of being a teenager. And he calls it the pose or the posture
Hmm.
in the book. So, I mean, how do you, is an interesting case for that reason, that, you know, he's this author that's on one level being accused of things that you would argue textually are not true, that, you know, he's not this raging misogynist, but then whenever we bring into the realm of identity politics, he clearly also isn't. So what do you make of that sort of, you know, he performatively in his own life kind of calls attention to this pose?
Mm-hmm. I think that's what's kind of great about Bret Easton Ellis, is that he calls us out in the many ways that we posture. So there's the posturing of fitting in, and that changes from decade to decade. And so you see his efforts to do that, and you see, I think, his struggles to fit into what seems to be most valued or most correct during certain decades. And it's really interesting that I don't know. I don't know that he didn't, after his nonfiction work recently, did he not get kind of raked against the coals for that, or am I misremembering?
Oh, yeah, he definitely did. Yeah, I mean, there was this like discussion of privilege, but I think it ultimately failed for that reason, because they were trying to say that he was this like privileged LA author, and it's like he's been writing about that privilege longer than this became like a cultural buzzword. So a lot of those critiques I feel like fell on deaf ears. There's an amazing podcast episode where he has Eli Roth, the director of Hostel and Thanksgiving, interview him on his own show about White. So yeah, I mean, that was a definite, he sort of almost was trying to be like on the edge of being canceled at that point. So that definitely happened.
I'm actually kind of impressed you managed to skate by on that one. He seems like one of the first authors to get canceled on both sides. So, but again, that's kind of what I appreciate about him, is that he is willing to just kind of tick everybody off. And that is a true satirist, is that he doesn't really let anybody off easy, and shows us the ways that it's very human to posture, to try to fit in, to try to, I don't know, do what's right without actually thinking about what might actually be right. So it seems exactly right to me that he's in the spot that he is, where he just seems to kind of tick off everybody. But at the same time, to find an audience who really appreciates the kind of satirical work that he's doing, and that I think gets the kind of posing that he's doing, that's actually showing us our own posing. It's a pretty great master work.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Tarantino, which something I've been thinking about a lot. I wrote an essay very early on in the pamphleteer's life that mentions Ellis characterizing millennials as generation wuss, and that's kind of what he's been most famous for in the last 10 years or so, before the Shards kind of took off and became this book talk sensation. And something I talk about in this essay is that, like, with the exception of Greta Gerwig, like, millennials and Gen Z are not really defining literature or cinema in the same way as authors like Salman Rushdie, Zadie Smith, Bret Easton Ellis, or filmmakers like Tarantino, or even Eli Roth. I know that Tarantino is a pretty consistent guest on Ellis's podcast, and there's kind of this funny moment when the Shards came out. Ellis was reading it first as an audiobook every day on the podcast, or every week, and passing it off as reality instead of a novel. And Tarantino was just like morally affronted by this and was just calling bullshit on him. And there's this great exchange where he's just like, what are you doing? Like, this is not real. Why do you think it is that these Gen X authors, and even a little bit before, are really still dominating our cultural discourse in a way that millennials and Gen Z, again, with the sidebar exception of Greta Gerwig, are doing?
Oh man, you're asking me to really think through the cultural movements, which I haven't done in a little while. I feel as if the way that things have shifted is that in some ways we have to have our art, our culture seem so perfect and fit within such a particular, almost political perspective for it to get made, that it has in some ways caused a gap in the kinds of really challenging, interesting, nuanced, surprising works that were happening before it. Um, it just seems as if, again, our film and our books have all tried to fit into this one or two kinds of things. And I think Gen X at least left a lot of room for kind of people in the margins to be doing surprising things, different things. This is still the time of, like, I don't know, even punk music being in, like, there's a role of the shock, of the surprise there. And I think now, with just the way that, again, we've kind of gotten pushed into our maybe social media vacuums, our holes, is that there isn't a lot of space for people who are doing things outside of those spaces, or at least not having the funding to do things inside of those spaces, or getting approved. And so there does seem to be a vacuum. And I'm glad that there's still those earlier filmmakers, writers, doing work in that area, because they need to show us, I think, the ways that even our morality has become a kind of like sliding down the surface of things, something that has become its own kind of posturing. So they're doing good work in that respect. And yeah, I just think that hopefully we're starting to see, with even the attention now back on writers like Ellis, that we might be finally ready, or the world, or Gen Z might be ready for a little bit of critique as well, of seeing themselves through maybe the mirror that someone like Ellis can maybe hold up.
Absolutely. And that actually really nicely leads me into my next question. Both of us are in academia, both of us teach classes. I've never taught a Bret Easton Ellis work before. I've recommended the podcast to some of my better students. I've talked a little bit about American Psycho, the movie. So, I mean, have you taught Bret Easton Ellis in a class before? And if so, what was that experience like?
Yeah, I taught the film adaptation of American Psycho. It was a while ago now, I think maybe 8 years. I'd say it went okay. Uh, it was pretty fascinating to me. I did a whole class on kind of postmodernism, both some films and some novels. And it just continually fascinates me what kind of sets off triggers in certain Christian communities and what doesn't. So I found with that in that class, they seemed generally okay with violence, but kind of freaked out if ever there was nudity, which I think kind of tells you something about us. But it was good. I think that they did a good job, at least in terms of catching with the movie, and just the way that it was a satire. I think the movie adaptation actually does a really great job of catching that for people who might actually miss that in the novel. Captures the comedy of it, and they were able to, I think, engage with some of the questions and some of the things he was doing. Other than that, I think I've only taught maybe a snippet of lesson 0 in a creative writing class when we talked about dialogue, but I haven't really been brave enough to try to teach the novel yet.
Yeah, and that's something else about Ellis that I didn't really realize until I was trying to put the shards into context for this piece that I wrote this week, is that really throughout his career, I called it in the article like the long march through the institutions, because every one of his books is really about the American elite. And he's sort of in that marginal position as being upper middle class. Maybe we could say wealthy growing up in Los Angeles when he did. But Rules of Attraction and Lunar Park are kind of both ends of academia. You have the affluent liberal arts college that was clearly based on Bennington, where he ended up getting his training and finishing up less than 0, and then him being a college professor on the other end of that in Lunar Park. But with American Psycho and Wall Street and Glamorama with Hollywood and modeling, he really does sort of serve as this person who diagnosed a lot of the cultural rot that we're talking about now in our current discourses. I mean, do you think that's something that's singular to him in that era?
Do you mean diagnosing our cultural rot?
Yes, in such an effective way. I mean, one could look at Lunar Park and the Rules of Attraction and really sort of bring it in. I don't know that a lot of the critics of Harvard today would really want to do that. I think they would resist somebody like Ellis because of the violent tendencies. But to me, a lot of the work that he's doing is very much a part of that conversation, and really is a lot more adept at handling than a lot of these think pieces by a lot of authors on the right about Harvard's cultural rot or Hollywood's cultural rot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely a tragedy that he probably isn't taught more often in the places that really could benefit from seeing his work. And I think that that's probably a wider problem of satire, that oftentimes the people who are the subjects of it are the least likely to be the ones reading it too. But I know that, like, I really enjoyed Philip Roth as well. Don DeLillo, like there's several writers who I think did a good job of showing us ourselves, especially around that time period. It's been a little while since I've kept up fully on the research with it, but he definitely comes out of, I think, a movement in that time that is especially dealing with the excesses of consumerism, with some of our disenchantment with some of the institutions that we kind of hold in value. Yeah. So sorry, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question quite well, but
absolutely are. And I'm so glad you brought up DeLillo, because I'm thinking about the Netflix adaptation of White Noise. And I mean, that was when I did my top 10 list of the films last year that I thought were the most effective. Like, that was my number 2, because I just thought it was a brilliant adaptation, and it was something that I've been looking forward to forever and thought no one would ever do. For our viewers, that was co-written by Noah Baumbach, who made Barbie with his partner Greta Gerwig. It is interesting that all 3 of those authors you mentioned go into academic satire. So their most famous books are about satirizing the institution of academia with White Noise or Rules of Attraction. So there does seem to be something there, I think, that a lot of people might miss if they're just sort of looking at the hot and bothered elitist take of Harvard or something like that. I did also want to go back to your article and how it presents the side of like Christian focused literary analysis. And it does challenge our assumptions of somebody like Ellis that a lot of people who are sort of coming to similar conclusions about culture might better themselves by reading. So, how does this work fit with the work that's being done at similar institutions or with similar journals as the one that you posted or the one that accepted and published this article? How does it sort of go along with the trends of scholarship at Christian universities or with Christian academic publishers?
Yeah, I think Christian liberal arts institutions are just really fascinating places in general. You read some of their student handbooks and some of the things we faculty have to sign off on to work there. And it's kind of hard not to laugh at how rigid it all seems. But at the same time, so many of them are guilty of kind of the so-called culture wars. And some, on the other hand, seem to really relish the role of academic as destroyer that just kind of criticizes, dismantles everything until there's really nothing left other than maybe the rubble. But I also think there's really are a lot of amazing people doing great work in these kinds of institutions and really diligently trying to push back at kind of the noise, do the work that I think academics were actually called to do, which is kind of to read, to learn, rather than just to criticize and kind of sit in the spaces where it's messy, where things are complex, and instead just kind of try to sort things out. And so there's definitely a mix in, so I published in the Christian Scholars Review, and I think that does consistently interesting work. There's definitely a lot of publications, a lot of these institutions have a mix to it, but I think there's so many people at each of them that are doing really lovely things. I went to Baylor, and one of my professors there does a lot of film and cultural critique from a Christian lens, and that was one of the first times that really opened up my eyes that those kinds of things could be done, that you could, you know, not maybe get fired for doing R-rated things, which seemed really scary initially. But I think that's where we need to be, is to engage in those spaces and to figure out how to make sense of both our world and also the great art that tries to show us our world a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, and I mean, I about 5 years ago, I moved from a large state institution to a Christian university,
Hmm.
and there is something I think that only professors at these institutions are really aware of because we're sort of cast out of the dominant bubble in some ways. I mean, whenever we're getting to sort of the more elite issues and sort of the academic bubble or the ivory tower, so to speak, we don't have to deal with that as much as and are able to sort of look at that apparatus outside of it. But at the same time, we're also sort of fighting back against rigid dogmas that maybe other stakeholders in an institution that's Christian would not want us to do. So we're really probably the only sorts of academics that are kind of fighting against both sides at once because somebody at Yale, somebody at University of Nebraska doesn't really have to deal with the culture war stuff in the same way as somebody that's a Christian university who's trying to balance those truths. So I'm was also very glad to have you on to talk about that just a little bit as well, because it's a very, I think it's a pedagogy, it's a way of learning that is very much rooted in the real realities of this country that, you know, a lot of people were shocked whenever Donald Trump became president of the United States in 2016. But, those of us that are in these institutions, have really sort of seen some of these things that maybe experts that are insulated from it haven't, which I think is kind of the fun of teaching in a place with that worldview.
Yeah, it's such an interesting kind of microcosm, and it's been fascinating for me too because I kind of straddle both sides already. Just from I grew up in rural South Dakota, so even just being somebody from a rural space who's done things like I worked with pigs, I know how to drive a semi, I do kind of weird things for an academic, and I would get really frustrated at how I would see like the people who are my family, my friends, my neighbors, how they're oftentimes categorized by some of the more elite, institutions or the way it's described. And I think I really got to see some of that frustration in the ways that it built, that they understand when they're being condescended to. And I think the academic institution really needs to share responsibility, or at least recognize the responsibility in increasing that problem, because it's definitely created, I think, a lot of the problems that they now complain about, and just don't admit, I think, any admission of guilt, that they have helped kind of create the conditions that have created somebody like Trump.
And that's something I'm always sort of cringing about now, and I'd love to know your thoughts on it, even though this is a little bit off script from what we were planning on talking about. Was just, we're kind of at this critical moment for higher education where a lot of very conservative people are saying college isn't worth it, don't go to college. And somebody that is in this position of, coming from what we would otherwise call a deplorable country or flyover country, is really bothered by this, regardless of your political beliefs personally, that the ideas are either go to this institution that doesn't understand your values or don't learn. And there's not really any sort of in between, right? I'd love to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's definitely been for a long time a skepticism in Christian communities about education. And this is just, I think, exponentially catapulted it as the culture wars, again, so-called culture wars, kind of get more and more dominant. I think there's a fear that learning will ruin your faith, that it might unsettle you. And I've always found that deeply troubling, because what happens instead, I think, is that if you don't get educated, if you don't come to a space where you're allowed to ask questions, where you're allowed to dig deeper, your faith in general is going to be much more likely to shatter once it does find something that doesn't fit within kind of the small, shallow framework that you've given it. And so when I continually hear people kind of look down upon universities as something that isn't worth it or that they need to avoid, it just makes me really worried about what kind of happens in the long run, and when are we giving space to just sit in nuance, to be able to figure out that a lot of the moral questions are much more complex than yes or no, black and white, and we just continue to keep reinforcing these cultural narratives of one or the other. And it's very troubling to me, and I really wish universities would be better about being a space that actually encourages students to avoid the black and white and to figure out like where all the colors are instead, and how rich actually education can be, and how it hopefully makes us a much fuller person who's able to think deeply about all the most important questions, rather than just kind of ruining us or maybe shaping us for a particular ideology.
And that really does dovetail with sort of the last question or the last point of conversation that I wanted to touch on, which is the fact that Ellis has really survived this cancel culture. I think based on your article and based on our conversation with American Psycho, he was always an author that kind of took a sledgehammer and a scalpel at the same time to the issues of his day that have sort of metastasized into the issues of our day. But especially starting with 2011, whenever he coined Generation Wuss, and then getting banned from the GLAAD Awards when he talked about LGBTQ activism as being under the reign of the gay magical elves, and was sort of starting to alienate in that middle period. He's now come through it unscathed in a way. He never really apologized. He kept doubling down whenever people were criticizing him. He got this podcast, and unrelentingly every week just kind of took aim at anything that he saw fit. And that, the book White, for our viewers who haven't read it, is really sort of a rewritten or revised selection of his monologues on his podcast. So The Shards has been a New York Times bestseller. It's a book that Gen Z, as you were saying, has really started to discover and, are reading in a way that I find really refreshing and hopeful. Given the context of the book and given the themes that Ellis is mining. And not only that, but to the point now where HBO has optioned The Shards into a miniseries that Ellis is going to be working on with the directors of the recent Nicolas Cage movie Dream Scenario, and Luca Guadagnino, who made Call Me by Your Name and Suspiria and Bones and All. Ellis seems to be the one cultural figure who got through all of this unscathed. For a while, the right was trying to claim him, and he somehow escaped that, which is one of the more baffling cultural things that's happened to me, anyway, at least in the last decade or so. But he's probably at a point now that his career-wise has not been at since less than zero. So what is it that's uniquely Ellis that made this happen?
Well, I've read his article too, where he's talking about Charlie Sheen back in the day, and just admiring the transparency about it all, just kind of being willing to show his real, authentic self and not let necessarily the media turn it into a redemption narrative or turn it into something that like Sheen just didn't want it to do. And I think Ellis, in some ways, is a little bit like that in that he, I think, in a lot of ways critiques his media image and tries as much as possible to just already critique himself or kind of show as transparently as possible who he is and not apologize for it. And so I think in our current age where it's supposed to all be about the authentic self and showing yourself and speaking your truth and revealing who you are, like messes and all for all to see on social media, it's that radical honesty that actually shows, probably, I'm guessing with Gen Z, some of the ridiculousness of what's supposedly transparency for them is in fact still a kind of posturing, still a kind of trying to fit in, still a sliding down the surface of things, still shallow, just as much false as Fashion and Fame would have been in American Psycho. And so I hope that there's a readiness for this. And if they are, and you say that they've been reading it and enjoying it, I'm really encouraged by that, because it is just a development that I think it's easy for us not to see the ways in which we still participating in the same kinds of things from the American Psycho's 80s, a form of consumerism. It just looks different. And so for him to be actually radically transparent, I think helps to, again, shine a mirror on kind of the false transparency that we've started to take as our new form of consumerism in this next generation.
And that actually reminds me of, there was that hilarious moment when Twitter first became popular in 2009, and Ellis was in one of those dry patches where like at 4 a.m. he accidentally like tweeted and tried to buy cocaine from a drug dealer. And then, you know, he, rather than like delete it or be embarrassed by it, like he not only like made fun of himself, but then he tried to auction the tweet off, like just doubling down on it, which is not really something that we see very often now. Like, I mean, he took this scandal and just kind of laughed about it. Which, you know, it was just like such an Ellis thing to do, like made this misstep a consumerist piece of performance art. And that's something I think our culture really does need at this point. So you can check out Dr. Davis's article. I think we've got, I linked to it in my review of The Shards. I think it's one of the best pieces of scholarship that I've read in a while. I did want to go ahead and, since we've been talking about the Christian university and Christianity's relationship to contemporary culture, I did want to provide you an opportunity to talk about your new book, which is not based on anything remotely related to Bret Easton Ellis, but I think thematically in some ways might have something to do with the arguments you've been making. So can you tell us a little bit about the book, when it comes out, what it's about?
Yeah, so I have a book on basically the imagination and spiritual formation. And it's looking at, in some ways, I guess, related to my Bret Easton Ellis research, in that it's looking at sort of problems I think I see in the Christian church today. So that includes consumerism, this idea that God can fix me, should fix me, consume me, use me, the way that we kind of arrange our churches to look like auditoriums, theaters, entertainment spaces. Christian nationalism is a big one that I'm critiquing as well. Culture war kind of blame pointing is in there. And what I'm trying to do is then recover something from the past. And the Christian imagination in ancient and medieval times is wonderful and weird in all the best ways. And so similar, again, I guess, a little bit to Bret Easton Ellis, in that I think looking at some of these works from the past, I'm trying to say disorients us. They're odd in a way that makes us see ourselves, I hope, a little bit more clearly. And by kind of training our imaginations, by listening to those stories, by looking at that artwork, I hope it can help correct or at least reorient us from some of the problems that we are seeing today. So I kind of pair one work from the Christian imagination past, whether or not that's kind of personifications of the virtues. I look at icons. I look at Gothic cathedrals. and use that to critique things like the Gothic cathedral critiques our auditorium churches. Icons help correct our nationalistic Jesus. It's just a way of kind of helping us, I think, reframe, because I'm sort of done with the kind of scholarship that only deconstructs, and I really wanted to offer something instead to kind of help reorient or recorrect. And so I love drawing from, like I said, some of the weird and wonderful things, I think, from the past to help us do that.
I mean, and that is one of the more interesting things that's coming out now. I saw Shia LaBeouf just converted to Catholicism. So there is this sort of, there is this push with Gen Z and millennials to really embrace, maybe not necessarily the Gothic construction of cathedrals, but
Yet.
the very traditional Catholicism or Episcopalian way of religion that is sort of making this very weird comeback like vinyl now, which I mean, I'm here for it. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but the book sounds great. So is it coming out later this spring, you said?
Yeah, I think it's July now, actually. So hopefully around July.
Great. Well, maybe we can do a review of it on the show. And the book is Becoming by Beholding: The Power of Imagination and Spiritual Formation. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really insightful talk, and I'm glad we got the chance to do it.
Yeah, that's fun. You have a very impressive range of films and works and everything at your fingertips. That was great.
Well, I'm sure hopefully we'll hear back from you soon at some point. So good luck with the release of the book and the semester.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. So speaking of institutions, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of my favorite films of the year. I was a little bit late talking about it because I've been sort of thinking about what I wanted to say regarding Alexander Payne's new movie, The Holdovers. I originally planned to write a review of this movie when I saw it toward the start of the Thanksgiving holiday, but in light of the plagiarism scandals with the Harvard president, and in light of the testimony, and in light of all of the discourse that's been happening about the elites, quote unquote, the movie kept sort of changing meaning for me. For those of you that have seen it, The Holdovers is a film by Alexander Payne, the director of such comedy dramas as Election, About Schmidt, Nebraska, The Descendants with George Clooney, and the movie Sideways, which may be what he's best known for. Payne is a Gen X filmmaker who came on the scene first with the movie Citizen Ruth, which was an abortion satire that manages to skewer both sides equally. I would say that he's one of America's greatest satirists. He's able to make this insightful cultural commentary while at the same time developing these characters who are three-dimensional and full of heart and can really make audiences of all stripes interact with them. One of the strengths of Alexander Payne, unlike a lot of other directors, is that he's a filmmaker from Nebraska, and he's never really lost that Midwestern sensibility, even when he's making a movie that's set in Boston, like The Holdovers is, or outside of Boston, that I should say. He's a filmmaker that's very populist in that way. He's very smart. He understands some of the elements of mass culture that are problematic, but he also understands how the interaction of regular people with the elites might be one of the major flaws in the American experiment. So The Holdovers is a lot of things. It's a Christmas movie. It is one of the best Christmas movies of all time. I think this is a movie that's really going to find an audience in a very similar way to a movie like American Psycho and Fight Club, just because of, by nature, it's a holiday movie, and it's one of the best ones. It's also a movie that is about the Northeast in a very similar way to this year's Eileen, which I talked about a few shows ago. The movie focuses on Paul Hunnam, who is a history and classics teacher at the prestigious Barton Academy just outside of Boston. He's a graduate of Harvard. He's come back. He lives a very lonely, isolated life. He's very curmudgeonly. And because of the fact that he refuses to pass the son of a senator who is dangling a donation check over the school, he's punished by being forced to remain back during the holidays and watch all of the students, the holdovers, who don't have families to go back to, or whose parents didn't want to have them back for Christmas, or for other extenuating circumstances, they weren't able to go home. The only other adult in the room is Mary Lamb, played by Joy Divine Randolph, who is a grieving mother whose son was just lost in Vietnam. And through being isolated, these character shells start to break out. the movie itself, the plot doesn't sound really that far removed from a Hallmark movie or a crowd-pleasing film, but the way that Payne is able to balance comedy and pathos is incredible. This is a movie that I think any audience from any different walks of life could go into and get something out of. It's a film that I would highly recommend to everybody if you haven't had a chance to see it. The Holdovers just won or Golden Globe awards for Paul Giamatti's performance and Divine Joy Randolph's performances in the film. This is a movie that I think is really going to get some Oscars momentum going forward in the next couple of weeks. Alexander Payne was actually just nominated for a Directors Guild of America award. So for those of you that follow the award season, this is a film that I think is going to have a little bit of a resurgence. It did okay at the box office. I was very frustrated because 15 years ago, this was the kind of movie that would come out in November and like Sideways before it become a massive blockbuster hit just based on word of mouth. And it was kind of unceremoniously, put into theaters and then thrown onto digital rental. And then it's now available on Peacock. So I don't really feel like it was given the promotion that it deserved. This is a movie that could really unite a lot of different people if they would give it the chance. So I'd highly recommend it. It is playing in some theaters. I'm sure it's going to get a little bit of a re-release soon. And for those of you who do subscribe to Peacock, the streaming service run by NBC Comcast, it is available there for free. So definitely check out The Holdovers. It is one of the best movies of the year. And we're going to end today, as always, with our weekly film rundown. So there are a lot of releases this week. Martin Luther King weekend has become sort of a box office draw over the past few years. A lot of awards contenders are expanding, but there's also a lot of major blockbusters coming out. My main pick for the week is a movie called Memory. And it stars Jessica Chastain and Peter Sarsgaard and directed by the Mexican filmmaker Michel Franco, who made the amazing, amazing, amazing political fable New Order back in 2021, which is probably one of the best movies about revolutionary politics ever made. This movie also, like The Holdovers, seems like a melodrama. Jessica Chastain plays a recovering alcoholic who is followed home by Peter Sarsgaard, an amnesiac who doesn't really know why he's following her. And the movie focuses on their relationships. I have not had a chance to see this movie yet because it is just now getting a release, but it is really one of the ones that I've been looking forward to the most over the last few months. So definitely check that one out. I'm also really excited about The Beekeeper, the new Jason Statham movie directed by David Ayer, who wrote Training Day and directed Bright and The Suicide Squad, and a really interesting Jake Gyllenhaal movie from 2012 called End of Watch. The Beekeeper is a revenge-o-matic, as Quentin Tarantino would say. It is a vigilante movie about a retired special forces agent who led a group known as the Beekeepers, who in the intervening years has become an amateur beekeeper on his own. He strikes up a friendship with his neighbor, played by Felicia Rashad from The Cosby Show and Creed. And whenever she's the victim of a phishing scam and ends her life, he goes on a quest to uncover a vast conspiracy. The movie's gotten really great reviews, especially for a film that's coming out in January. But a lot of the negative reviews talk about sort of the politics behind the film. So for me, I think that's going to make it even more interesting to check out this weekend. Another movie that I'm looking forward to is Andrew High's All of Us Strangers. This movie features Paul Mescal, who's kind of gotten a cult following online lately. And it's about a lonely, isolated screenwriter who meets Paul Mescal's character and then decides to go home and figure out some of the problems with his past. So this is a movie, again, that I'm really looking forward to. It's going to be playing at the Belcourt. Probably the biggest release of the week, and one that's also gotten some pretty good reviews, is the reboot of Mean Girls, which is based on the Broadway show. For those of you that say Hollywood is running out of ideas, I think the fact that Mean Girls being remade based on the Broadway musical that was based on the original film is probably evidence that that might be the case. But the movie, again, features Tim Meadows and Tina Fey from the original. And we also have an appearance by John Hamm, which looks hilarious. So the trailer really just seems almost like fan reenactment of the original Mean Girls, but it might be good. The musical element makes it a little bit fresh. It also features the pop singer Renee Rapp as Regina George. So maybe it's going to be good. Maybe not. Who knows? It's definitely slated to be the box office champion this weekend. Another couple of other releases that I wanted to mention is the Jerry Lee Lewis documentary, Trouble in Mind. It's an entirely archival movie that's playing at the Belcourt on Monday. And it's directed by Ethan Coen, one of the Coen brothers of Fargo and No Country for Old Men fame. And the really cool thing about this movie and the local connection is that music producer T-Bone Burnett gave Ethan Coen a lot of this footage. For those of you that saw the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, T-Bone Burnett worked on the Coen brothers, getting the bluegrass music right for that particular film. So they've had a long creative partnership. T-Bone Burnett is actually going to be in attendance at the Belcourt screening at 8 o'clock on Monday of this film to talk about the process. So for those fans of bluegrass music, country music, the Coen brothers, Jerry Lee Lewis, this might be a really great ticket on Monday as long as the weather holds. A couple of other releases to talk about, and one that I find interesting from an industrial analysis perspective is the fact that this week marks the first time that Disney is going to be re-releasing all of the movies that it dumped onto streaming during the pandemic in theaters. So we start with the movie Soul, the Pixar film from 2020, starring Jamie Foxx as a middle school music teacher, jazz musician who gets into a coma and has to reunite his body and his soul. This movie is going to be playing for the first time in theaters. This is kind of Disney's mea culpa that maybe this strategy of getting out of the theatrical game and releasing stuff straight to streaming wasn't the best idea. We're also going to have re-releases or big screen releases of Luca and Turning Red over the next months. Another movie that just seems kind of like an oddity to me this week is The Book of Clarence. And it's produced by Jay-Z. It features Lakeith Stanfield as a pauper named Clarence during the time of Christ, who's inspired by Jesus's journey and goes on his own spiritual redemption. It looks kind of like a satire. I can't really get a good feel for it from the trailer, but at least it's going to be an interesting film. The last thing that I wanted to mention is two of the Belcourt's film series. The Belcourt always does some really interesting programming of repertoire movies. And this has really been a season where two of its most impressive lineups have been announced. So they're doing two programs. One is called Winter Classics. And this is everything from The Shining and Frozen to 101 Dalmatians and Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller. This week, 101 Dalmatians is showing for the kids, and The Great Silence, a really underrated spaghetti western, is going to be showing for the adults. The other series that the Belcourt is doing is called Sunday Suppers. So every Sunday, the Belcourt is bringing a movie about food. Some of these films are amazing movies that I think definitely deserve a watch on the big screen, like Babette's Feast. I know that's a favorite among the pamphleteers' office, a really great drama from the early 90s, late 80s about food. But they're also going to be showing other movies, such as this week's Peter Greenaway movie, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, which is one of the best films of the 1990s. This sort of gangster satire epic. You see, I Am Love is going to be showing. Big Night showed last week. My Dinner with Andre and The Taste of Things, which is the big Juliette Binoche Oscar contender. That's what they're going to be ending with in February. So there's not a lot going on right now. Nashville's really cold. It's rainy. Going to some of these classic films and series at the Belcourt might be a really great option. So that concludes our weekly film rundown, the first weekly film rundown of 2024. And that also concludes our show. So have a great weekend, and whatever you do, give it some thought. This is me signing off. We'll see you next week.